All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. At the request of somebody who commented on one of the videos on my YouTube channel, I have decided that we are going to do a basics series, which I will be able to report on and post up on the blog so that everybody can sort of have a place to go if they want a survey of some basic world building topics before they head into our archive of like a million tiny little specific topics. Because you know what? A million tiny little specific topics are really cool. But if you need a lay of the land first, that is not a problem. So I thought this would be fun to do. So welcome, Kat. What is world building and why do we do it? Well, I think the thing that most people think about when they first hear the world building word is people who go out and create massive secondary worlds. That is one of the aspects of world building, but it is not the only aspect of world building. So people who create massive secondary worlds do it often because it's fun. It's sort of like an art project. But that's not necessarily what we are talking about here. So that's one of the aspects that I consider world building. More importantly, for me at least, my basic concept of world building is creating a sense of a time, place, basically creating the sense of the setting on a page. It's a writing task, but it can also be a speaking task. So creating a sense of place when you say something like, so there I am on the field and I'm running down and you know, and I trip on some, you know, on a tussock of grass and I go flying in the dirt, you know, the mud splashes all over my soccer field outfit. I don't know. I mean, like, but my point is when you're storytelling, even if you're verbally storytelling, aspects of the place where you were are important to your story. And you have to sort of bring your listener or reader along. And it can be very helpful to create a sense of place when you're doing that. So I consider it to be something that is not exclusive to genre, not exclusive to science fiction and fantasy, but also you can also use it as a skill in nonfiction, or you can use it in, you know, like real world based fiction, mainstream fiction, or other kinds of
romance and crime both involve huge amounts of world building.
Oh, absolutely. Romance and crime, huge amounts. Yeah. So anytime you're telling a story, basically, it doesn't matter what the genre is, sense of place is a really important component of that. So, yeah.
Juliet, thank you. I just realized that I hadn't thought about what I consider important when I'm reading non-genre work, but it is that really strong sense of world building. It's why I love John Irving novels and Khan Potok novels, and they're about getting insight into a whole culture and milieu, about all the expectations of life that somebody else has in a long ago and far away, or the same as in the far future or the never was.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, there's some great world builders out there who, you know, are not in the science fiction fantasy genre, as you were mentioning. I'm thinking specifically of the guy who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And I'm not bringing up his name in my brain right now.
Stieg Larsson?
Yes, Stieg Larsson. There we go. Thank you, guys. Thank you for being my instant Google. But Stieg Larsson is amazing because he creates this very strong sense of place, and he places you in Sweden at the beginning of these novels, and you're there. You're in Sweden. and it's funny because, you know, you hear people say, well, you know, can you really handle a book that places you someplace other than, you know, the place where you live? And of course, for science fiction fantasy folks, it's kind of like, why would you even ask the question? But at the same time, if the world building is done well, you won't necessarily even care whether this is a familiar environment, because it will feel familiar to you, or it will be familiar enough that you can navigate through it without a problem.
As a lifelong Angeleno, occasionally they do stories set in my hometown. And it's always interesting to see what somebody else's conception of my hometown is.
Yes.
There are so many Los Angeles.
There's so many Los Angeles, and I've just been watching Lucifer, and that Los Angeles, I recognize it, but I recognize it as a Hollywood Los Angeles.
As far as I can tell, that Los Angeles is entirely set between Sunset and Wilshire, and never goes outside that.
They've gone into the suburbs at least maybe once or twice as they go to somebody's house.
But if they're going to somebody's house, it's somebody who like lives, works, and operates in that milieu. It's very specific.
It's very much it's a total subculture there.
Well, and so I'm glad you're bringing up the question of subculture, because in fact, one of the absolute keys, for at least for me, to world building is culture. And in particular, I tend to ground my sense of setting in the cultural viewpoint of the protagonist. And if there are multiple point of view characters, that grounding should be, in my mind, slightly different for each character, because different people's experiences of the same place, just as Kat was saying, are not going to be the same. So different points of view can actually lead to very different portrayals of the same place.
On that subject, purely coincidentally, I was reading Clifford Simak's The Werewolf Principle earlier today, and that is a book in which the protagonist has basically 3 different minds and bodies that can switch between one and the two. The opening scene is from an alien protagonist in our world. And does a great job of showing how strange. They're in a thunderstorm and they're going like, what the hell is all this water? Where's it coming from? This is just totally unreal to me. And then the second chapter switches to the human version of the protagonist, who is just walking around in the thunderstorm, stubbing his toe and soaking wet, but considering it perfectly normal. And it's a really, really good way of showing exactly the same environment with 2 completely different mindsets that approach it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a scene from Staying Dead. Is Laura Ann Gilman's first book in, I can't remember what the series is. She describes an elevator lobby in an office building, and she describes it very well. I used to work in the building where that lobby is, so I just rolled around laughing at the description. But because I worked there, I know it was a good description. What I don't know is how it looks, if it's as useful to someone who didn't work there. Do they see, they won't see exactly the same thing because they weren't, but do they see and not feel? Because I would feel things when I see. Do they see the same things that I'm seeing?
Probably not all of them.
Not the feelings.
I will guarantee that even other people who worked in that same building and walked through that same lobby every day will not see that description and their mental image of it the same as you do.
And this is actually an interesting question. And Che, I'm going to get to your question in a second. What does your protagonist notice about their environment This is something, an incredibly important question, because different protagonists will have different viewpoints and notice different things. Different times of day, the same person walking through the same place will see it differently, right? Or maybe they walk through the same place at the same time every single day, but their agenda is different on that day. On one day they're in a hurry and the other day they're not, right? They will notice different things. So there is a useful level of subjectivity that comes with working with a protagonist in an environment. Okay.
One of the interesting things that I've seen as I've been doing critiques and developmental editing is that there are readers who really want the author to be describing in a way that suits the way the reader sees the world.
Yeah.
Because some people really, really love very lush, rich, you could just paint the scene from the author's narrative.
Yeah.
And those people will complain when reading something written by either somebody who doesn't approach the world that way or somebody writing about a character who doesn't have a very visual approach to the world.
Yeah.
And they'll say, well, it's all missing. But the very lack of that thing is itself a certain kind of world building.
Yeah.
And a certain description of what's happening. So the choice of what to describe becomes very, very important in conveying other parts of the story.
Well, so absolutely. Absolutely. And the amount of world building that your reader will expect can also depend on the genre. So if you're writing steampunk or if you're writing romance, there's going to be an enormous expectation for detailed description of clothing. Right. Whereas other kinds of contexts don't necessarily call for that. I mean, you can always go about describing your clothing, but if you leave it out in a steampunk environment, people are going to go, but wait. Right. So the genre does have an influence on it.
Yeah. It's a reassurance that you are in a steampunk environment.
Absolutely.
If they don't tell you they're wearing goggles, you're going to be like, well, how do I know it's steampunk then?
You know, this is actually interesting because one of the questions that I find relevant is what are the key details, right? And the key details are going to vary depending on what you're trying to do. And there are things like goggles that are emblematic of a particular type of setting, right? I think I've mentioned this like 20 times, but I'm always having to mention electricity on the first page of my Varent stories because otherwise people look at the social context and they go, oh, it's like ancient times. and then it messes everything up. So, you know, you kind of have to put key details in up the front.
I just picked up, I was visiting a friend and got shown I guess it's called a graphic novel if it's a bound edition of the Young Avengers comic. And I realized reading it that I did not have enough context to understand what I was looking at because I could see the pictures and I could read the words, but there were all these visual cues being embedded in about who characters were and what their context was and what had previously happened in the story that I was completely befuddled by because I was coming at this without enough context. And yet when I asked my friend about them, some of them were just things that he said, well, no, don't worry about that. That's not important. Or at least he was sort of going, I don't know if that's really relevant here. And I realized that it was that thing about, I've shown genre stories to non-genre readers and they stumble and they say, well, what do you mean there was a matter transmitter? What is that? And there are things that we take for granted as readers of genre work, and we just, oh, it's a phaser pistol or it's a laser rifle, and we just don't ask for more than that because we've already absorbed through the large mass of other works that we've read or encountered. We know what that is, and we don't need the description. In the same way that if you say telephone was once a very clear thing. I think now we are going to have to describe telephones again, and it's a little disturbing.
That is a good point. Well, okay, so yes, this is definitely something I want to touch on. So I have this thing that I have done in the past as part of workshops, and I offer it actually on my Patreon as a high level reward, and it's called a ridiculously close look. And ridiculously close looks are fun, but basically what it means is going through the opening piece of a story word by word and taking a look at all of the contextual details that are brought into the scenario by each word as you go. And sometimes a word will not bring in a whole lot, and sometimes it will bring in a whole raft of stuff. And sometimes, you'll have other words that will show up and then modify the possible things that the previous word brought. And it's a super detailed, finicky little thing to do. But on the other hand, it can be very helpful because if you've written something and you have a particular setting that you intend, and people are like, well, but I think it's this thing over here. And you were like, well, but I kind of want it to be this thing over here. Sometimes it comes down to, I used the word king when I shouldn't have. And all of a sudden, people have locked themselves into a monarchist, earth-based, medieval environment. It can be something like that. These things happen really quickly. And a lot of it depends on how much people have read, right? What they bring with a particular word has to do with where they've seen that word before. But anyway, it's a kind of a useful exploratory process. It's something I always like to sort of say, this is kind of a fun thing to do to the beginning of your story if you're wondering about how easy it is to enter the world that you are talking about.
So Samuel R. Delany did something like that in one of the essays in the Jewel Hinged Jaw, which is back in print, where he starts analyzing the first sentence of a story, starting with "the," which, as I recall, to him was like a gray oval. But then every word in the sentence, how it causes the reader to retcon the image, or build on the image, one of the two. What the reader thinks is going on.
Yep.
So it's a good essay.
Do you know the name of the essay?
No, but it's collected in the Jewel Hinged Jaw.
Okay.
It's in the book. I don't remember which essay. I read them all one after another. So I forget how far in it was.
Okay, so I'm still trying to tackle Che's question.
Mahjong journey.
What are the genre requirements? Okay, so what do you do if you've never built a world before? Actually, no, it's really not that, because most people do build worlds. They just don't know they're building worlds.
Yeah, but I think the thing is to help them articulate what they're going for and why.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
And the way that when you change something, it changes other things. I think a lot of people, they change one thing and then don't really follow through with how it affects the entirety of the world.
Okay. That is something that we can talk about in more depth at another time.
Sorry, is that the butterfly effect of world building?
Yeah, it sort of is.
Yeah. If you change one thing, you've got to follow through on what that change really means. You can't go like, it's like our world, but there's always been magic. It's like, well, why, if there's always been magic, does the world look exactly like I know it looks?
Oh,
right.
This is why
when
I'm
did
really
magic come in?
This is why I'm really
if it was
mad
keeping
at
us
the TV
warm
series.
instead of fire, we could have a problem on our hands.
Yeah, I'm really mad at the TV series Timeless because I'm upset that they have, and we have time travel, but we're going to use it to keep the world just like it is. Like,
Time travel.
With the transporter technology, Star Trek always ignores the implications of transporter technology in their stories.
Yeah. And I would argue that J.K. Rowling completely ignores the impact of magic on the world.
Sure.
As I say, the world looks exactly like our world, except secretly there was magic all along. It's like, you really think our world is going to look exactly the same as it does right here in the 20th century, 21st
well,
century?
That's actually a good question. So I see people who criticize J.K. Rowling's world building for various types of reasons, but that's one, right? World building does not have to be deeply historicized and, you know, super detailed in order to be effective, fortunately. Right? Because my goodness, if we all had to do that amount of speculative work, it would be exhausting.
No, we're supposed to build our own languages for every culture we have, and entire dictionaries and historical sagas, even if we never use them in the story. What? Sorry.
Yeah. So
some people like doing that.
I think a lot of it has to do with story focus. You will be more likely to explain how a telephone works if the details of how a telephone works are really key to the plot of the story. Right? I mean, if your climactic event relies on someone who knows how a telephone works explaining to somebody who doesn't know how a telephone works perhaps it's good information to have in the story. I'm not sure I know what that story would be.
Well,
I mean, I can imagine there would be one.
Let's work it backwards. I think that in order to tell a story set in, say, any time before 1990 that is intended for a millennial or younger reader, you need to explain that the telephone was not available. You know, there would be these stories where you couldn't get to the telephone in time because it was in the other end of the room, as opposed to because you couldn't find the handset, or all those stories where you were looking desperately for a payphone.
Yeah,
these aren't stories we can tell anymore. I mean, I just watched 15 seasons of ER, and in the first half of the series, there are all these stories involving not being able to reach the doctor because the only thing that they can be reached by is their pagers. And by the end, everybody has cell phones. And if you're telling a story that does not carry contemporary context, I think that we have to explain certain things. So it's not so much because telephones were working as wires, it's what is this thing about this device for communication that is unique compared to just talking to somebody that needs to be explained in the context of the story. And if you're talking to somebody who grew up with wired landlines and payphones, we know what those things meant. But now suddenly I think we need to acknowledge that unless we only want to write for old fogies, I can't believe I just said that, we need to explain. I need to explain to my children that, you know, what dialing a phone was about. And
also,
transmitting pictures seemed like magic.
Something else to consider about that, I mean, regarding telephones, for example, they color how we think of story tropes and ideas. A lot of horror movies and horror concepts from the 70s and 80s pretty much relied on isolating people. And one of the easiest ways you did that was you put them somewhere where there wasn't a phone. Well, nowadays, it's really, really, really hard to put someone where there isn't a phone. But because all of those stories, you know, we're still riffing off and using concepts and structures of stories that were created in those times, we come up with all manner of excuses. You know, we set them places where, you know, there's no cell phone coverage, and there are such places, I'm not disputing that, but we make various excuses. You know, oh, the battery dies at a crucial moment in so many movies now, because it's like, oh no, suddenly I can no longer use my phone because this is the exact moment where the plot would break down if I could. So we do that. We give ourselves excuses all the time for doing this, because we've grown up on structures that worked in a certain way, and we frame ourselves still in those structures. I suspect that, you know, people coming up in the next 10, 20 years who are writing these things will use the phone concept in a completely different way. They won't be like, you know, oh, I've got to put this person out of touch or whatever. They will use the fact that people are always in touch as a horror motif much more, rather than the concept of the isolation.
I confess that I took down an entire plant of communication net in order to achieve this.
There you go. You see, we do that, and there are good reasons for doing it. You know, and there can be, you know, story relevant reasons, but in many cases, what we see is, you know, a story that would have worked in 1980 and 1990 doesn't work in 2010. You can't write that same story, that same structure, because you have different things that, different considerations that simply make it not work. You know, people wouldn't do that particular thing or act in that way because they now have a social structure or a technological structure or whatever around them that simply didn't exist. You know, now we live in an era of rolling news, of everything being available on our smartphones at an instant as normality.
Right. But not everything.
We need to. No.
We have these invisible algorithms that we don't see at work, you know, and that's a whole other type of thing that we could build in as a possible problem, etc.
Yes, I mean, you know, you can envisage ways in which people's information is so filtered, again, as a horror story. So how, you know, the apocalypse happens and nobody knows about it because it's all filtered off Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and so forth. You know, there are a bunch of people running around going like, I don't know where that smoke's coming from, and they can't find out because the information gets filtered out.
So there's a story that H.P. Lovecraft wrote in 1919 called The Statement of Randolph Carter, which relies on a phone actually connecting for the horror, where he has a portable phone, which in 1919 nobody had, but there was a portable phone prototype kind of thing. And the horror is one person on one end of the phone goes down deep into this tomb and encounters monstrous creatures, and Randolph Carter is listening at the top, the ground level, to everything that's happening. He can't see any of it. He has to imagine it. But eventually, you know, I'm going to spoil the end of an 80-year-old story. Eventually, this other voice comes on the phone, and a grovelly, monstrous voice says, and the guy's Warren is the character underground. He says, "You fool, Warren is dead." You know, and Randolph Carter has to run.
So what we're looking at is world building, setting the scene and explaining things as a description of the world view of either the person who's having things explained to them, because, you know, their worldview has to be different. Yeah, I'm not focusing on this today. Because I think Juliet has said it before, you know, the world building and how you describe things is how you show the reader or the other characters, you know, where the person who's describing it is coming from, where they live. Because if you know, at the same time as you listen to one of us talking and saying, you know, talking about landlines and talking about not being able to get through on the phone and that sort of thing, you know where we're coming from. But if you were to listen to one of our kids talking about phones, you would have to try to see from their point of view how they grew up without the landlines, because they didn't. I mean, we've got both. Some of us are adjusting really well to, of course, I can get in touch with so and so because they have a cell phone and I have that number, but they don't have both spaces. And having them explain how it feels to not have ever been in the space that we grew up in, is that'd be tricky. I'm constantly amazed by the things that my kid writes that I don't really understand because I can't see it from that angle very well.
Yeah.
Even though they're a really good writer.
So I have a couple things that various people's statements have brought me around to, because one of the questions is how to pick which details to describe. And again, these are things that we could spend long time on. But if you think about what an object brings with it, take an object, for example, like the telephone. If you place a telephone in a story, it brings with it the entire history of the telephone and the entire history of all of the technologies that the telephone relies on. So there are certain types of objects or concepts that you would benefit from bringing into a description because they do a lot of work for you in setting up aspects of how this world has come to be. So that was one thing I wanted to point out. And that's something that could take a whole hour to talk about. And the telephone tends to co-occur with certain other types of technologies and behaviors and that sort of thing. So by placing one object in the story, you can set up a whole lot of expectations about what people know, the kinds of behaviors they engage in, the history of wherever this place is.
I'm going to dispute that, Juliet.
Well, yeah, okay. Dispute away.
So, and this ties in neatly with the thing that I was thinking about, which is, so Kate Tempest Bradford and Nisi Shaw are running a series of workshops called Writing the Other. And it's a persistent question that I get asked about a lot. And we're talking these days about hashtag own voices, because there's a question of who is this description for, who is the expected reader, and how much do you have to explain?
Yeah.
And when you say telephone, the fact is right now in the various African continental places, people have gone from no communication to cellular phone and mobile phone access,
right,
without anything in between.
Right. Yeah.
Yep.
And so the assumption that we have is that you would have gone from, telegraphs to landline, with operators, to being able to do your own operator work, to having wireless devices. This is a progression. It is the classic progression, but there are other progressions out there. For instance, there's the North American narrative of how cell phones spread, and then there's the one in Europe where they didn't have one of the intermediate technologies, so they didn't have to dismantle it, so they had better access earlier.
Right.
So,
and also in Asia, the cell phone use has a different history.
And also, for instance, the history of fax devices in Asia is very different than the history of fax devices in the US, because being able to send a bit of essentially illustration means that also you could send Chinese characters much more easily than typing.
Yep.
Because you could just handwrite them and transmit them. And so deaf kids in Japan were using faxes, where American deaf kids were using teletype devices.
Yeah.
So there's a danger in assuming that. I think it's good for somebody writing to be clear when you introduce a telephone, what else came with it? Did it come with all this other history, or was it suddenly dropped in, and why?
Okay, I will I will completely agree with you. I think that there is an implication that some kind of history of those things has happened, but there is nothing that says you can't mess with that history or have experienced it from the outside in some way or in an alternate fashion because you weren't enmeshed in it as it was going on. Absolutely.
Means having to be aware of your audience and what their default assumptions are. That if you are looking at a United States, I'm gonna mess this up. If you're looking at English language, the United States, yeah, I don't know the words to say default.
I think the question of default is a really good one to bring up.
Yeah. Then you can assume that they that went through what we think of as the telegraph and telephone and all of that. And if you're going to use something else and you need other cues to say, no, this is not, it didn't happen in this country, that the person, either the person you're talking about grew up someplace else or the story is set someplace else. And you have to be very clear that that the background they're assuming isn't there.
Yeah. So if you still have the same audience with that set of expectations, then often you have to deliberately work against those expectations in your description, right? If you can't assume that set of default assumptions is going to come into play, then it's a completely different ballgame.
Yeah.
So I have to go a bit early, but I'd just like to get a thought in. It's in a different direction. Michael Moorcock, who is, for those who don't know, Grandmaster, science fiction and fantasy, major influence on the genre in the 20th century, at least, was one of the guests at Silicon Valley Comic-Con, and he was asked about world building in his panel. And he said he never did world building. And he, by which he meant, and because what it became clear with his subsequent comments, what he meant was that, figuring out what a realistic weather pattern might be for this particular landscape in this kind of secondary world, or just to say a world other than our own, and that the next element would be this, and then he would just have the landscape and the weather reflect the mood of the character, which comes out of the Romantic tradition of the 19th century. And so, we're talking a lot about the kind of world building that, makes logical sense, right? Like even how the telephone is introduced into a particular society, or, how you use it. And I just want to say that there's also a way of storytelling. I'm not sure that that's not world building, but it's certainly different, where the whole, the ideas informing the story that you're throwing at the reader are based on emotion and maybe even something like dream logic, which is not, if you start picking it apart, it might not work. This is why I think why Harry Potter was so successful, because it doesn't matter that magic didn't change the history of the world. In fact, it's crucial that magic didn't change the history of the world, because it's about the feel. You have to have this hidden society that you feel can be there in our world, and which is also not only magical but charming, at least in its introduction. And in order to achieve that, Rowling had to ignore the implications of the existence of that shadow world, and that was important. So, and it was highly successful, and it was highly successful because it resonated emotionally with the reader. The same way the crazy landscapes that Elric and Michael Moorcock's other heroes travel across with, impossible geography, which are explained away as the influence of great magics that are chaotic or whatever. You know, that's crucial to the success of those stories and books, and that is, you know, counter to the kind of world building that we mostly talk about, which is having a world that seems to make sense, right? That holds up to scrutiny, a scrutiny of logic. And I would just say that we need to keep in mind that we don't always need to create worlds that hold up to a scrutiny of logic in order to have a successful story.
No, absolutely. I agree with you. Because in fact, that in itself brings in a set of cultural assumptions, right? The idea that some kind of logical realism is of value in storytelling is not necessarily an idea that we have to hold, right? So, absolutely.
Sure. Okay, thank you. I have to go.
Yeah, thanks for making the point. Appreciate it.
Yep.
I think that's a really interesting question to ask, is what do your readers require of the story? And it's one of the cultural storytelling tropes of what's expected. Is it expected to be real? Is it expected to be an allegory? Is it expected to be sort of this epic romance of we don't care about anything other than the moral qualms of the protagonist? I mean, there are lots of other ways of telling the story rather than building a world.
Right. Yep.
I will argue, having said that and having supported that the thing that happens if you're a reader coming at it from not entirely within that world, is that all the littlest things that are being assumed are still a kind of world building, at least about the cultural matrix that the story is being told in.
I think that one of the dangers is world building without thinking that you're world building, because you're going to bring in setting details and lots of sets of expectations with them. And that can happen without you even really planning it. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it can be really problematic. It's a really important point.
Yeah, because there's the physical world and the personal world that the reader lives in, the physical world and the personal world that the writer lives in, and the physical and personal world of the characters that are being written. And that is a lot of different worlds.
Yeah.
With a lot of different assumptions.
Yeah. So if you're completely new to the process of world building, how do you get started? I think honestly, the answer is A, you've already started. Just go back and take a look at what you've done and kind of look for clues as to what your subconscious brain is telling you. The other thing is, I think it's helpful to realize that everything's connected. And things are not always really systematically connected. But it's helpful to think of them as being connected, because it will help you to sort of, yes, foot bone connected to the ankle bone, says Brian. It will help you to think about, hey, I know that the patella exists. The patella is my great fantastical concept that I'm introducing in this story. Okay. So let's go find the ligaments and the rest of the bones and the, all that stuff. I think it's.
But I think
you can find your way into world building in multiple different ways.
Yeah, and that's true. And the recognition that they're not always logical connections, that there are or what appear to be logical connections. Things that are connected that don't always appear to be, they seem to be non sequiturs, but if you follow the person that they're making those connections, you can understand them. Like how is doing the dishes connected to the laundry? well, you go through the kitchen and you see the dishes and you clean them, and then you finish your way to the laundry.
Things can be culturally connected.
Mm-hmm.
They can be physically connected.
Mm-hmm.
They can be thematically connected.
Mm-hmm.
They can be metaphorically connected. I mean, there are lots of ways for things to interconnect.
I remember seeing recently an article that was talking about if you showed people from different cultures a monkey, a banana, and an apple, or I don't remember what the third thing was, what things would they say were the most closely related? And for some people, they would instantly go banana and apple, they're fruit. And other people would say banana and monkey because monkeys eat bananas. And so how you group things together is also part of the way that you're organizing things, and how the logic of how your story unfolds is influenced.
I think people can also make the mistake of thinking that that only one of those connections is valid.
Yeah.
That you have to be aware that, and I guess that's part of the whole perspective thing is knowing that. That was your point, Kat, really.
Right. Well, if you're educated in the West, you are trained into a certain set of a certain discipline of what goes with what, but we're so indoctrinated into it that it's hard to see outside of it, and to be able to conceive that, oh, actually there are other ways to organize this data. We end up being given a lot of standardized tests which essentially tell us there is one way.
Yeah.
So I think when we're trying to write vivid genre work that will endure, and if we're going to be completely crass or pragmatic about the business of writing for publication, things that don't adhere very tightly to a certain normative worldview are currently very much in demand. So it's a good thing to keep in mind as one attempts to not get mired in one specific set inadvertently. I think it's okay to get to decide to stay in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think, as with most other things, it's better if you do it with deliberation.
Yeah.
It's helpful to be purposeful.
Although maybe that's a cultural prejudice too.
So Che is remarking that she likes to pick a milieu. Tell us about that, Che.
Well, I sort of realize I sort of when I start something, I pick a time-ish and a place-ish. And it's not necessarily super specific. The book I'm actually writing right now, I ended up picking 1930s Depression era America. But at the same time, I have a bunch of made up towns, and then so far I've been tweaking things just a little bit off from what would be the actual references about time and place. And I will decide later if I sort of maintain it as sort of an alternate universe or go full on 1930s America with it. And then with a book I'm revising is a sort of early 1800s-y Europe in a metropolitan city-ish. So it's I've created what I hope are fairly specific places in those places, but it's not based on hundreds of hours of research. Mostly because I'm lazy.
Well, I mean, it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell. I mean, the amount of research that Lorianne Gilman did for Silver on the Road was, whoa.
Yeah, and like I can't afford to travel.
But you know what? That's not the type of story you're telling either.
It's a matter of focus. What you need to do is make sure you don't need to build the whole world. Because your protagonist is only in a small section or whatever of it. So you need to bring the protagonist's close surroundings into very sharp focus. But the more distant surroundings, their town might need to be very, very minutely described and laid out. The country, not so much. Other countries might literally be names when, some cloth from somewhere, or a carpet from so-and-so comes in, just to give a little bit of context of there being an outside world. And you don't need to know where these places are. There is a Bakutan carpet in the room. You don't need to tell anyone about, the language and culture of Bakuta. You just know, they make carpets there, and this guy's got a carpet from that place. And you don't go into any more detail than that. You don't describe the particular, weaving style that they use, and how the wool for it is gathered and anything like that. It's focus. You tell people what they need, what to know, and let the rest.
And what people need to know is often usefully organized by what the protagonist needs to know.
Yes, there's a lot of overlap there. But there are times when you really need to know something
about the worlds than their characters do.
Yeah, sometimes you need to know something that the protagonist doesn't, and vice versa. It depends what you're doing. You have to be very careful with that withholding knowledge kind of thing.
Yeah.
The moment I hate in every book is the cutaway where they're sitting around, they're going to make their plan, and they go, so here's what we're going to do, ... And then you find out, as the plan actually happens, but the protagonists know. It's like that you've created artificial attention because you don't know what their plan is, but they know what their plan is. So I hate that stuff. I hate that stuff.
We could talk about that too.
You don't watch caper stories, huh? Okay.
Generally speaking, that you can do good caper stories without doing that. But yeah, generally speaking, I mean, things like Ocean's 11, where I can't remember if it's Ocean's 11 or Ocean's 12. There's one of them where basically it turns out that the entire movie you've been watching didn't actually have any effect whatsoever, because they really did something else early on, which you find out at the end. And everything you've been watching was just basically fake. And I feel cheated by that kind of story. I don't go, aha, that was clever. I go like, well, why did you show us the fake story and then tell us the real story that happened in like a 3-minute flashback sequence right at the end of the movie?
Yeah. Well, I hear that, but we're at the end of our hour. I hope this got into it a bit. I hope this started answering what world building is and why we do it. We've picked up some good stuff. So I want to thank you all for being here and discussing this with me. I am going to formulate some sneaky thing, I think, between now and next week to try to see if there's a step 2 based on some of the stuff that we've talked about this week, because I want to kind of do these in a clump, as it were. But I appreciate all your contributions, and yeah. So I think maybe entry points might be good. Might be a good topic to do. Any other thoughts that you have that might be a next step after this one?
I put in the chat bar that we could do one where we take like a what if and then expand on it as an example, which might help out some new people, because like sometimes you come up with a what if, but then you just kind of let it die off because you don't know what to do with it or how to develop it.
Okay, so expanding on that, I think what is being suggested is kind of cool, which is why don't we all pile on and figure out what a world would be if you took on a particular assumption.
Yeah, like, you know, I mean, one of the most basic ones is, what if there's werewolves? What if there's vampires? What if there's magic? What, you know, those are, you know, those are a lot of the real basic kind of what ifs that I think people come to a story with, or like, I need magic in this thing. How do I do it? Or what do I do with the magic? Or, you know, stuff like that. I don't, you know, or like,
I think that would be a cool thing to do.
What if people can fly? How does that change things?
Yeah, so I've written that down. I think I want to do entry points next, because I think it would be useful to talk about what it's like to start with a person, what it's like to start with a phenomenon, what it's like to start with a place.
Yeah.
And that may end up following on into how to develop a concept once you've decided on it. And I think that's your what if question. So thanks for these ideas. I'm going to stop the broadcast at this point. We should meet next week. Same time, same bat channel. All right. Thanks so much.
Alrighty.